grew in the various cacti and seeds and roots of different plants. And they began to do, knowing this as sort of a background to it, in the 60s and right up until the 70s, the research was done using LSD and psilocybin, and the studies showed remarkable attributes that they were very useful in treating addictions like alcoholism, severe anxiety and depression. The research in alcoholism showed that through randomly controlled clinical trials, a single dose of LSD had a significant beneficial effect on alcohol misuse after the first reported follow-up, which was between 1 and 12 months after these test subjects were released from the treatment program. And the 3 trials that they did reported total abstinence from alcohol use by 1 out of what was it here? Like a 50% success rate after just a single dose of the LSD. These medically supervised experiments in the 1950s using LSD resulted in their a generally acknowledged fact that the ego reduction that LSD often induces can help people such as recovering alcoholics. Terminal illness, LSD dramatically improved the pain, depression, and fear of death that some of these patients were going through. Now, of course, in the history of these psychedelics, there's always been a reaction to them, as I mentioned in the last program, by governments and those in charge seeking to control. And the same was, the same happened in the 1970s here in the United States. LSD was made illegal by classifying it as a Schedule I drug. Now, Schedule I drugs are claimed to possess significant potential for abuse and dependence and have no recognized medicinal value, and so that renders them illegal for any purpose without special, difficult to obtain approvals, the kind of approvals that you would get if you were a scientist or doctor doing some research. So LSD became increasingly hard to get, and so a lot of the research that was being done and could have continued was not able to be done because access was denied. Now, as for it being a Schedule I compound, as I mentioned, Schedule I's are considered to have significant potential for abuse and dependence. So psilocybin and or LSD does not fit into that definition because it is not really possible to abuse such drugs since they do not have any sort of addictive quality to them, and in fact the result of their use in terms of the hallucinogenic experience goes down considerably each time that when you use them regularly. So there's no dependence or abuse factor involved. And as for it having no recognized medicinal value, well, obviously the research that shows that it has quite a good deal of medicinal value negates that idea. But there was a lot of fear about it because there had been people who had adverse reactions. You've heard stories of people on bad acid trips, and it has happened, and it does happen. And people have hurt themselves on these sorts of trips, which is why these, as far as therapeutic use is concerned, it's always done with someone present to guide and help. But most people who have had experiences with LSD have not had those kinds of experiences. And the drug itself does not cause any kind of overdosing or anything of that sort. So just recently then, a gentleman by the name of Michael Pollan, who's known for his food essays and such, began to have an interest in the resurgence of LSD and LSD research. This started, the article came out in 2015 that he wrote. That's his initial article on research into psychedelics. And he came across this article called Hallucinogens Have Doctors Tuning In Again, which detailed some trials that were being done at NYU using psilocybin, the ingredient in magic mushrooms. And one of the researchers was quoted as saying that under the influence of this hallucinogen, individuals transcend their primary identification with their bodies and experience ego-free states and return with a new perspective and a profound acceptance. Well, this is this experience that I talk about when I talk about, experiencing the everyday news and information that comes at us from a higher perspective. Because these news stories and all of the presentations that we get exposed to are designed to trigger our egos in one way or another. By transcending that, we see things quite differently. Okay, back to this study. Patrick had never taken a psychedelic drug, but he immediately wanted to volunteer. This is a young man, well, not a young man, but a man who had cancer in his lungs. So he took the trials and he took the hallucinogens with these psychiatrists, guiding him through it. And they did one with an active placebo. We've talked about placebos and their effect, and one that actually contained the psilocybin. And during the session, music was played. And I love the choices of music here. Brian Eno, Philip Glass, Ravi Shankar. And the therapist would guide them, with guided meditations. And these trials at NYU are part of this sort of renaissance of psychedelic research, and they're finding amazing, new responses using these psychedelics. So in talking with these researchers, Tony Bossis and Stephen Ross, Michael Pollan here, this author, found that cancer patients receiving just a single dose of the psilocybin experienced immediate and dramatic reductions in anxiety and depression, and these improvements were sustained for at least 6 months. And this data they're going to submit to a journal for peer review, and the researchers talk about their sort of skepticism about their own findings. One of them said, "I thought the first 10 or 20 people were plants, that they must be faking it." They were saying things like, "I understand love is the most powerful force on the planet," or "I had an encounter with my cancer, this black cloud of smoke." People who've been palpably scared of death, they lost their fear. The fact that a drug given once can have such an effect for so long is an unprecedented finding. We have never had anything like it in the psychiatric field. Well, you've had it for over 50 years. I mean, never had it. I mean, it's like waking up and finding what has been right in front of you the whole time. Silliness sometimes gets to me. Anyway, I was surprised to hear such unguarded enthusiasm from a scientist. And a substance abuse specialist about a street drug that since 1970 had been classified by the government as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Neither of which is true. But and a street drug? No. So many researchers are describing their findings with excitement, using the words mind-blowing. People don't realize how few tools we have in psychiatry to address existential distress. Xanax is not the answer. Gee, you figured that out, did you? So how can we not explore this if it can recalibrate how we die? But anyway, so there's greater enthusiasm, and apparently now it's getting easier for researchers to be able to get access to these now, because the DEA and the FDA have increasingly been allowing researchers to do these psychedelic studies. So in 2006, a study at Johns Hopkins found that psilocybin, magic mushrooms, can induce mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. A 2008 study found that 80% of sufferers no longer qualified for a PTSD diagnosis, that's post-traumatic stress disorder, after MDMA-assisted psychotherapy with these drugs. The first LSD studies in decades are finding no link between the drug and mental illness, and that patients report benefits from treatment. Now, that was one of the horror stories that was also floating around that led to the sort of criminalization of LSD, was that it caused you to go crazy, which is understandable when you do have a state that takes you out of your regular mind. And it had been stated that, and there is some truth to, if you do have psychiatric difficulties, it can trigger some disassociation, and so care would need to be taken. If you do have those, you would not want to mess around with psychedelics necessarily. But it doesn't in itself cause craziness. Now, another study in March 2015, Rick Doblin, a gentleman from an organization called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.